Before and during World War II, a lot of interesting aircraft appeared in France. Some of them were strange and obsolete designs, but some of them were cutting edge with good performance. So in this collection, I put together my videos about the French planes. So without further ado, let's jump in. Chapter 1. The Bloch MB.200 bomber. The years after the First World War were an interesting time for aircraft designs. As though new technologies were constantly used by the manufacturers, the peacetime evolution was much slower than during the Great War. And it stayed like that until the mid-1930s, when a new arms race began, reigniting the use of new ideas in aviation technology. Because of that, many designs developed in the early 1930s were completed just before the new technological advances, such as more powerful engines and better understanding of aerodynamics, were available. This led to the interesting French designs developed in this period of time. Just like other European powers, the French also started to modernize their forces in the early 1930s as an answer to the events in Germany. As a part of the modernization program, in 1932, the Air Ministry announced new specifications for a new 5-seat night bomber to replace the aging LeO 20 biplanes. The specifications asked for a 5-man crew, around 1,200 kilograms of bomb load, and at least 1,000 kilometers range. The Bloch company started to work on a new plane for the specifications. Their plans were in line with the French aircraft design trends of the time, with flat sides, a high-wing monoplane construction, fixed undercarriage, and several gun positions mounting 7.5mm machine guns. The bomber used two Morane 14 KDRS engines, each of them producing 770 horsepower. The Bloch design, of course, was not the only one proposed for the new specifications. Many French manufacturers were interested and hoped to receive big military contracts. Some of the proposed designs were the LeO 300 and 301 models, the Poitiers P41 design, the Bordelais AB20, the Farman F.220 and 221, and of course the topic of our video, the Bloch MB.200. After the Air Ministry reviewed the proposals, the Bloch and Farman designs were chosen as winners, though in the end the two bombers were used for different combat roles. The first prototype of the Bloch MB.200 made its maiden flight in mid-1933. Because of its very blocky design and bad aerodynamics, its maximum speed was below the requirements. But at that time, speed was not considered to be the most important factor for a night bomber, so the test flights were considered successful. On the prototype, some of the gun positions were still open ones, again in line with other designs of the time. The Air Ministry in January 1934 already placed an order for 30 units of these bombers, and because of its simple design, the production of the type was set up fairly quickly. Because Bloch at the time didn't have the capacity for mass production, the Poitiers company received the order. The first production model already made its maiden flight in July 1934, and these models started to enter service at the end of the year, just about 18 months after the first flight of the prototype. The production models now featured enclosed gun positions and received all the necessary military equipment. But the first experiences with the MB.200 revealed some problems. The wings needed reinforcement, the landing gear also proved to be too weak and prone to crack, and the engine suffered from heavy vibrations, which was fixed using different mounts and shock absorbers. Even before the type entered service, new orders followed the first one, and by mid-1935 the number of planes ordered from the type exceeded 200 units. By the end of 1935, 12 squadrons were equipped with these bombers. The pilots and crews liked these planes because they were reliable and easy to fly, though they had fairly bad maneuverability and they were very slow. With the added military equipment, the top speed was reduced to just 285 km an hour. During production, the bombers received several upgrades as well. The original 770 horsepower engines were replaced with 900 horsepower Morane 14 KIRS power plants, which allowed the bomb load to be increased to 1400 kilograms, without sacrificing any performance. Smaller bombs up to 100 kilograms could be carried in the bomb bay, and larger ones up to 500 kilograms on outside bomb racks. There were also several experimental variants tested with different engine types to improve performance, but these never made it further than the prototype phase. The MB.201 used two Hispano-Suiza 12 engines. The MB.202 model featured 4 of the Morane 7 KDRS power plants. and the MB.203 was tested with the Class J14F diesel engines. By the time the MB.200 entered service, Bloch already worked on an improved variant of the type, which featured a more advanced design than the original bomber, but not by much. The MB.210 model had a longer fuselage. Unlike its predecessor, this variant was a low-wing monoplane, and to improve on its aerodynamics, it also featured a retractable undercarriage and retractable gun positions. We will also look at this model in a future video. The MB.200 was 16 meters long, with a wingspan of 22.45 meters, roughly the same size as the later B-25 bomber. It had an empty weight of 4,300 kilograms and a maximum takeoff weight of 7,480 kilograms. The bomber was powered by two Morane 14-cylinder radial air-cooled engines, each of them producing 900 horsepower. With these engines, the aircraft was quite underpowered. It could only reach 285 km an hour top speed. It had a range of 1,000 km and a service ceiling of 8,000 meters. It had the usual defensive weapons used on most French bombers at the time, including three 7.5mm machine guns, one in the nose, one in the ventral, and one in the dorsal positions. And it could carry 1,200 kilograms of bombs. The first MB.200 bombers entered service at the end of 1934. In 1936, the bombers flew their first combat mission in the Spanish Civil War. The first two units were airlifted there, and later additional 30 bombers were delivered by ship and assembled in Spain. Though only being in service for less than 2 years, these missions already showed how obsolete these bombers were, and approximately 1/3 of them were shot down in a few months. By the start of World War II, the French Air Force still used 169 of these bombers. By this time, the modernized MB.210 already entered service, but they didn't replace their predecessors. The bombers flew missions both in Europe and on the colonies, and many of them were lost, especially when they flew without fighter cover. The big and slow aircraft was an easy prey for the Axis fighters. By the time the Battle of France began, only 22 of them were in frontline duty, and even those were relegated to transport roles. The rest were sent to flight schools to participate in training. After the fall of France, some of them were still used by the Vichy government, mostly as transport aircraft on the colonies. The type was also used by Czechoslovakia, who acquired a license in 1935, and the production began in 1937 at the Avia and Aero factories. They built 124 units altogether. After the occupation of the country, these bombers were taken over by the German forces, who used them for training, and some of them were passed on to Romania, Bulgaria, and Croatia. The bombers were used until 1941, when they flew their last combat mission in Africa, used by the Vichy government against the British. The Bloch MB.200 bombers were developed just before the aviation technologies gone through a big evolution in the mid-1930s, and that made them obsolete even before World War II started. But maybe this fact and their unique looks are the things that makes them an interesting part of the aviation history. Chapter 2. The Liore et Olivier 45 bomber. In the early 1930s, the French forces went through a reorganization, and as a result, in 1933, the Air Force became fully independent. To modernize the bomber force, the leadership initiated the so-called Plan 1, which called for more than 1,000 new aircraft to enter service by the second half of the 1930s. Among the different models, there were 350 units from different bomber types as well. But the bombers entering service in the coming years were mostly based on earlier and by this time mostly obsolete design philosophies. As these planes were already obsolete even when they entered service, in November 1934 new requirements were set for a 5-seat multipurpose medium bomber that would incorporate the latest technical developments. The requirements were a top speed of 400 km an hour, around 1,000 kg bomb load, and at least 700 km range. In order to achieve the required speed and have a more aerodynamic shape, it was proposed that the new aircraft should be designed without a nose turret, which was so prominent on earlier models. About a year later, the Aeronautical Technical Service received several designs for these requirements. Amongst them, the Latécoère 570, the Amiot 341, the Romano 120, the Bloch 134, and of course the LeO 45. During the evaluation of the designs, it was decided the defensive weapon in the dorsal position should be a 20mm cannon, and the crew was reduced to 4 men, resulting in a new project name, changing it from B5 to B4. During 1936, in light of the appearance of new more powerful engines, which were capable of delivering more than 1000 horsepower, the specifications changed again, now asking for 480 km/h speed instead of the earlier 400 km/h. By this time, the new development program Plan 2 was initiated, which called for 984 of the B4 medium bombers, organized in 41 units. Most of the proposed designs received a contract to build prototypes, and the LeO 4501 model was finished in January 1937 and made its maiden flight the same month, powered by 2 Hispano-Suiza 14A radial engines, developing 1080 horsepower each. It was an all-metal low-wing cantilever monoplane, featuring a twin-tail design and a streamlined glazed nose. To be able to carry the bombs internally, it featured a main bomb bay in the fuselage and 2 smaller ones in the wing roots. It could carry a maximum of 1400 kilograms of bombs, and its armament consisted of a 20mm cannon in the dorsal position, a 7.5mm machine gun in the ventral position, and a fixed forward-firing 7.5mm machine gun in the nose. The type showed great performance, reaching 480 km/h speed at 4000 meters altitude. But it also showcased problems with the engine cooling and some stability issues during flight. In September 1937, the prototype was transferred to the CIMA for official evaluation. By this time, to fix the instability, it featured new larger vertical tail fins. However, the engines were still troublesome, and in December, the prototype had a dual engine failure, forcing it to perform an emergency landing on a field, and it only stayed relatively undamaged thanks to the skills of the pilot. To try to fix the constant overheating and malfunctions, new engine cowlings were developed for the type with larger, more efficient air intakes for the oil coolers. The changes had a positive impact, but the Hispano-Suiza engines still had many troubles during testing. So in August 1938, a decision was made to abandon them and use the Morane 14N models, which could deliver similar power but proved to be more reliable. With this modification, the bomber reached its final form, and with the new engine came a new designation, LeO 45101. The test flights continued until February 1939, though actually in November 1937 already 20 LeO 45 models were ordered, and a further 20 units in March 1938. However, the change to a new engine delayed the production of the type considerably, as in October 1938 the manufacturer was instructed that all production bombers should use the Morane engines. As a result, the first production model only made its maiden flight in March 1939. The French high-performance medium bomber was finally ready to enter service. But even then, the production of the engines and the required propellers was too slow to catch up to the manufacturing of the airframes. And as you probably noticed, we are inching closer and closer on the timeline to the breakout of World War II. The French Air Force also noticed the rising tensions in Europe, and by this time they were sending out orders in a fast rate, under the Plan 5 initiative. In February 1939, 100 units of the B-4 bombers were ordered, followed by another contract in April for 480 planes. By the outbreak of the war, 749 LeO 451 models were ordered, but only 22 were delivered, and from those, only 10 were already in service. Let us now take a look at the technical specifications of the production models. The LeO 451 was 17.17 meters long, with a wingspan of 22.52 meters, roughly the same size as the later B-26 bombers. It had an empty weight of 7,530 kilograms and a maximum takeoff weight of 11,398 kilograms. The bomber used 2 Morane air-cooled radial engines, each of them producing 1,060 horsepower. With these engines, it could reach a top speed of 498 km/h and a cruise speed of 420 km/h. It had a service ceiling of 9,000 meters and a range of 2,900 kilometers. The plane's armament consisted of one 20mm cannon in the dorsal turret, a 7.5mm machine gun in the ventral position, and another 7.5mm machine gun in the nose. It could carry a maximum bomb load of 1400 kg, either two 500 kg or 5 200 kg bombs in the fuselage, plus a 100 or 200 kg bomb in each wing. The LeO 45 was the original design, with his Panos USA 14AA engines. The production aircraft using the Nomron 14N engines was renamed to LeO 451. The LeO 451T was a transport version used by the German forces. The LeO 453 was a post-war variant using Pratt & Whitney engines, and they were used as transport and search and rescue planes. The LeO 454 was a single prototype tested with the Bristol Hercules engines. A high-altitude version using the Nomron 14R engines was planned under the designation LeO 455. Another post-war model was the LeO 455P, which was used as a photoreconnaissance aircraft. And the LeO 451E was a flying laboratory used to test the air launch of various weapons. As we mentioned earlier, despite the large amount of LeO 45 bombers ordered and additional production lines set up, at the outbreak of World War II, only 10 of these bombers were in service with the French Air Force. In the following months, more and more orders were placed, and the total amount of LeO 45 bombers ordered ended up at some 1,549 units of different models. Before the Battle of France began, the accelerated production resulted in the delivery of 222 planes, but only 54 of those were combat ready by May 1940. They flew their first combat mission on 11th of May, and though the LeO 45 models were developed for high-altitude, high-speed operations, the nature of the following battle forced them to fly low-altitude attack missions against the German motorized columns many times. Their high cruise speed and a very dangerous 20mm cannon in the dorsal turret in theory could keep them relatively safe, but because they flew low-altitude missions and many times without fighter cover, the German fighters usually had an advantage against them. Many of them were lost on the airfield as well, as the French forces were not ready for the highly mobile nature of this war. Despite the heavy losses, the units were able to get new planes, as now the production ramp up before the war paid off, and these bombers were built in a very fast pace. By the time of the armistice, 452 of them were built, and they flew more than 400 missions. They stayed in service under the Vichy government, and actually further 102 units were built before the German occupation of southern France stopped the production. They flew numerous missions in North Africa, and from 1942 the captured bombers were used by the Allies as well, mainly for transport duties, but they were also deployed a few times on bombing missions during the Tunisian campaign. The German forces also used some of these planes as transports, and 12 of them were in service in Italy with the Regia Aeronautica as well. After the war, most of the 67 surviving planes were used for years as transports and trainers, and some of them for specialized work. The last of them retired in 1957. The LeO 45 series was a very advanced design for its time, on par with later medium bombers in speed and bomb load. But they are barely known as they had very little time to show their qualities because of the quick fall of France. Chapter 3. The Morane-Saulnier MS.406 fighter. These planes, though they were the most numerous modern fighters of the French Air Force, and more than 600 of them were in service when the Battle of France began, still had the worst kill-to-loss ratio during that period. The French pilots were not just outnumbered in the engagements, but their planes were much slower, had weaker armament, no armor plating or self-sealing fuel tanks, and used weaker engines, compared to their German counterparts, like the Messerschmitt Bf109E version. You could ask how these planes, being worse than other contemporary designs, became the main fighters of the French Air Force. So let's rewind the time to the 1930s to understand the history of the MS-406. In the 1930s, after Hitler came into power, the conflict between Germany and France seemed more and more inevitable every day. And in light of the German rearmament, the French Air Force started to modernize its forces as well. In September 1934, new requirements were issued by the Aeronautical Technical Service for the so-called C-1 fighter design, a new modern interceptor monoplane with retractable undercarriage to replace the old Devotin D371, D500 and the Liore 46 types. The competition for the new contract was fierce, with several French manufacturers submitting their designs. Morane-Saulnier entered their MS.405, which was a new venture for the company. As though they built fighters during the First World War, this aircraft was their first low-wing monoplane design with retractable undercarriage and a closed cockpit. It used a construction of mixed materials, wood in the tail and metal tubing around the cockpit, and was built around the Hispano-Suiza WWII engine, which incorporated a 20mm cannon firing through the propeller shaft. Though at the time of the competition it was adequate, over time this engine choice severely limited the performance of the fighter. The MS.405 had many rivals in the competition, such as the Blériot-Spad S710, the Bloch MB.200, the Devotin D513, the Liore 250, and the Nieuport 161. The first prototype of the Morane-Saulnier design was finished in August 1935 and made its maiden flight in the same month. This variant was built with a fixed landing gear, which was later replaced with a retractable design. After the initial test flights, the prototype had the military equipment fitted, and it was delivered to the CIMA in January 1936. The new fighter showed excellent flight characteristics. It was easy to fly, and it managed to reach a top speed of 480 km an hour at 4,000 meters altitude. But the testing and development of the type was fairly slow. After the trials, the type needed some modifications to the wing platform and also received a new propeller. The second prototype, incorporating the changes, only flew in February 1937. It was tested at CIMA during June and July, but soon was destroyed in an accident. To speed up the process, even before testing of the second prototype began, in March 1937, already 15 pre-production aircraft was ordered for further evaluation. But again, the production of these was very slow, and they were only delivered through 1938, with numerous small differences between each aircraft. The first one flew in February 1938, and the last one was delivered in December. During the 1937 comparison trials between the designs of different manufacturers, the Morane-Saulnier was the most convincing, as many of its competitors were plagued with technical problems, delays, or in the case of the Liore design, simply performance issues. So the MS.405 in the end came out as the winner of the competition. As a design, though it was complicated, met all the specifications, and its flying characteristics were very good. From the 15 pre-production planes, the number 4 became the base for the production models. Plenty of changes and updates were applied to the type even after production began, as the first orders for these fighters were awarded to the company even before testing was concluded. 50 units were ordered right after the pre-production variants in April 1937, then a further 80 units in August. In April 1938, a bigger order of 825 aircraft was placed, followed by the last order of 90 units in August. The production aircraft differed from the initial design in so many areas that its designation was changed to MS.406. It featured redesigned lighter wings, a new engine, and a very complicated and frankly unnecessary retractable radiator under the fuselage. This radiator design was a complete waste of resources, as the aircraft could only reach high speeds in level flight when the radiator was in the retracted position, but this quickly caused the engine to overheat, so maximum power at high speeds could only be used for a very limited time. There were also cases when the radiator released by itself during maneuvers. The complicated design of the aircraft meant each fighter needed somewhere between 12 to 15,000 hours to build, so production was very slow to ramp up. In 1938, only 28 units were built. 25 in January 1939, 34 in March, 95 in May, 147 in August, and so on, ending up with 932 produced by the end of 1939. And until the signing of the armistice in June 1940, 1,098 units were built in total. The first MS-406 models were accepted into service in early 1939, but the type was riddled with problems. Apart from the mentioned radiator issues, the propeller pitch settings many times didn't work. The landing gear could release spontaneously in high-G maneuvers. The machine guns could freeze up at high altitudes, not to mention their limited ammo count. Based on the feedback after the first deliveries, the improvements on the type continued during production. But even in its finest form, the MS-406 had many drawbacks, as in the more than 4 years since 1935, when the type first flew, the aviation industry seen many new developments, and the new fighters, like the Hurricane, the Spitfire, or the new Messerschmitt Bf-109E models, all featured more advanced aerodynamics, stronger engines, and heavier armament than the French fighter. The Bf-109 and the Spitfire were both powered by excellent engines. The German Daimler DB601 and the British Rolls-Royce Merlin, both producing around 1,150 horsepower. Thanks to these engines and their better design, these types were almost 100 km/h faster than the MS-406. So let's take a look at the actual specifications of the French type. The production variant of the MS-406 was 8.17 meters long, with a wingspan of 10.61 meters. It had an empty weight of 1,895 kilograms and a maximum takeoff weight of 2,540 kilograms. The fighter was powered by the Hispano-Suiza WWII engine, producing 860 horsepower. With this engine, the plane could reach a top speed of 480 km/h at 4,000 meters altitude and a cruise speed of 320 km/h. It had a service ceiling of 9,400 meters and a range of 1,400 kilometers. The fighter's armament consisted of one 20mm cannon and two 7.5mm machine guns in the wings. The MS-405 was the original prototype, initially built with a fixed landing gear, which was later changed to a retractable one. The MS-406 was the production variant, which featured all the modifications applied to the type during development, the two most prominent changes being the new lightweight wing design and the retractable radiator. The MS-410 variant was developed after the combat experiences in 1939. This version featured 4 machine guns in the wings, which were now belt-fed, and they were also heated, as experience showed the machine guns in the wings were prone to freezing at high altitudes. It also featured a new windscreen and gun sight, and had the capability to carry external fuel tanks. In early 1940, 500 MS-406 was ordered to be upgraded to these standards, but soon the conversions had to stop as all the fighters were needed during the Battle of France. One of these MS-410s was fitted with the experimental Hispano-Suiza 12Z engine, producing 1,300 horsepower, creating the MS-450 variant. The new engine dramatically improved performance, but in the end it did not enter production. The MS-411 variant featured the Hispano-Suiza 12Y45 engine, producing 950 horsepower. This variant also featured a fixed radiator, and it became the base for the Swiss D3801 variant. The next MS-412 was tested with the 1050 horsepower Hispano-Suiza 12Y51 engine, and this variant became the base for the D3800 type. The finished so-called Morane was a heavily modified variant of the type, featuring a strengthened fuselage, a new, more streamlined engine cowling, and it used captured Klimov M105 engines, which produced 1,100 horsepower. These versions carried 4 belt-fed machine guns in the wings, and the 20mm cannon was changed for either a German MG151 type or the Soviet UBK machine gun. The modifications significantly improved the fighter's performance, with a top speed of 525 km/h. The MS-406 entered service in early 1939 as the first modern monoplane fighter of the French Air Force. By the time of the German invasion, it was the most numerous type in service, and the backbone of the fighter force, together with the American Curtiss H-75s. During the Phoney War, they were mostly used for air defense and reconnaissance over the German border. But isolated skirmishes with German fighters happened from time to time. These engagements highlighted the weaknesses of the type, such as the light armament, lack of armor plating, unreliable weapons and radio equipment. When Germany invaded France in May 1940, the type was outclassed by the German Bf-109s, which were faster and more heavily armed. But many of the MS-406s weren't lost in a dogfight. The rapid advance of the German army forced the French Air Force to relocate to airfields further away from the front lines, and many times they had to abandon or destroy the grounded planes themselves. Still, the French pilots achieved around 190 aerial victories, and lost about 150 MS-406 fighters to enemy actions, but almost twice as much was destroyed on the ground, either by German raids or by the French forces themselves during a retreat. After the armistice, the Vichy French retained a small number of fighters mainly for training purposes, but they were kept in active service on the French colonies, such as Syria, Madagascar, and Indochina. Some other countries used the type as well. Switzerland purchased the rights to manufacture the type under license, and the results were the D3800 and 3801 types, which were later developed into the D3802, which featured a stronger 1250 horsepower engine, allowing this type to reach 630 km/h speed. And finally, the D3803, which featured a 1500 horsepower engine and 3 20mm cannons. Though its performance was impressive, with 680 km/h top speed, but only one prototype was built in light of the arrival of newer fighter designs. Finland ordered 30 MS-406 models in early 1940, and later in 1943 these were joined by around 50 units, which they purchased from the Germans, who captured a large number of these fighters. Though by this time the type was obsolete, these planes were so heavily modified they almost became a new type, featuring the Soviet Klimov M105 engine and heavier armament. We can conclude the main reason for the failure of the MS-406 was probably its complicated design and too slow development, which made this fighter obsolete by the time it entered service. The French authorities tried to correct this error when they requested new fighter designs in a 1936 competition, which was won by the Devotin D520, a plane that would have been a better match against the German Messerschmitt fighters. But only a few of them were in service when Germany invaded France. Chapter 4. The Farman F.220 bomber. The militaries around the world all started using aircraft for different roles in the First World War. But after the Great War ended, the development of aviation technologies slowed down in the 1920s, but sped up again during the 1930s as tensions in Europe started to rise again. The interwar period was a time of experimentation for the aircraft designers. The engines slowly became more and more powerful, and many new inventions appeared. But still the monoplane constructions were new, and the aerodynamics were not very high on the list when it came to new designs. This was especially true to the French bombers developed during the late 1920s, early 1930s. Like the Amiot 140, the Bloch 210, or the topic of our video, the Farman F.220 series, which was developed for a 1929 specification for a 4-engine night bomber to replace the Leo 20 biplanes. The specifications asked for 2,000 kg of bomb load and at least 2,000 km range. Farman's first attempt to enter a design for these specifications resulted in the F211 model, a high-wing monoplane using hybrid construction and 4 of Farman's own 9 EBR engines, each of them producing 280 horsepower, mounted in a tandem push-pull configuration. The bomber made its maiden flight in October 1931, but right from the beginning the test flight showed several problems. The controls were heavy, the construction of the aircraft too weak, and the maximum speed was disappointing as well, at 195 km/h. After the let's just say not too impressive tests, by the next year an updated variant of the type, the F212 was finished, now using 350 horsepower Nomron engines and featuring a longer fuselage and increased wingspan. This model managed to reach 250 km/h top speed. But despite having an overall better performance than its predecessor, the F.212 was not a success, and this model was soon abandoned. No surprise there, as by the time this model even made its maiden flight, Farman already developed a much more impressive design, using the experience they gathered on the F.211, and this was the F.220. This design was a more advanced aircraft, now using an all-metal high-wing monoplane construction, and it was much bigger than the former models, almost 6 meters longer, and its wingspan was nearly 10 meters larger. Despite the size increase and its modern metal construction, the 220 was very much an evolution of the former models, like the F.211. Using the same engine configuration, 4 engines in 2 nacelles in a push-pull fashion, and the wing shapes and the fuselage design was also reminiscent to its predecessors. The first prototype of the new F.220 was built using the 600 horsepower Hispano-Suiza 12 engines, and made its maiden flight in May 1932. The plane had a top speed of 245 km an hour, and was able to deliver 2,200 kg of bombs to 2,400 km range. It also featured 3 defensive guns, which, as on most bombers around that time, were placed in open positions. But this model had its own problems as well. For example, on one of the test flights, the bomber experienced so extreme wing flutter that several rivets broke and ricocheted around the aircraft like bullets. Luckily, the crew managed to land the plane, so the prototype was not lost. The F.220 was eventually rejected, and it was later modified for civilian use and sold to Air France, where they renamed it Le Centaur. The following model, the F.221, featured many changes. It used the 730 horsepower Morane 14 KBRS radial engines, a redesigned tail, and enclosed gun positions. This variant made its maiden flight in November 1933, though at first the cooling of the tandem engines caused problems, but this was so resolved with new engine nacelles. The test flights of this model were deemed satisfactory, and the type was sent to armament trials in early 1934, and it was now powered by the new 800 horsepower 14K DRS engines. Thanks to the extra power and redesigned fuselage, this variant managed to reach 290 km an hour speed at 4,000 meters altitude. By the end of the year, the Air Ministry ordered 10 units from the F.221 BN5 models. In August 1935, the first model, F.221-01, was returned to the factory to be modified with a new retractable landing gear. This update resulted in the redesignation of the model from F.221-01 to F.222-01. A small series of 12 F.222-1 models was ordered, and the work on this started in spring 1936. These models, featuring the new 870 horsepower Morane 14 KIRS engines, could now reach 325 km an hour speed, and featured additional fuel tanks, giving them an extended range. In October, a second batch was ordered, with again numerous changes based on the flight tests. They received a dihedral on the outer wing panels to help with stability, a redesigned front fuselage, which was 90 cm longer, the step on the bottom after the bomber position was eliminated, and the nose had a slight slope to improve visibility for the pilots. These changes again resulted in a new designation, F.222-2. A third order of 16 units of the new models followed soon in December. The official flight tests of the F.222-2 models started at the SEMA in November 1937, and they entered service by December, joining the earlier models and replacing the Bloch 200 bombers. The type actually was further developed into the NC-223 model, using 4 910 horsepower Hispano-Suiza engines, a new twin tail, and a redesigned fuselage. The first few planes from the military variant NC-2233 BN5 models were delivered to the French Air Force in May and June 1940. 3 civilian NC-2234 models were built for the Air France, but they were put into service with the Aéronaval, and one of them, the one named Jules Verne after the famous French author, actually became the first Allied aircraft to bomb Berlin in June 1940 during a 13-hour-long mission. But more about that when we get to the service history of these planes. For now, let's take a look at all the variants. The F.211 was the first design presented to the 1929 specifications using 4 280 horsepower engines. But after the disappointing flight tests, it was quickly followed with the F.212 variant, featuring a longer fuselage, larger wingspan, and 4 350 horsepower engines. But soon, these smaller models were abandoned to concentrate on the F.220 design, which was much bigger and used a 600 horsepower Hispano-Suiza inline engines. This model was later modified for civilian use. It was followed by the revised F.221 variant, which was built with 4 730 horsepower radial Morane engines and featured a new tail design and enclosed gun turrets. 10 units were built from this variant. The F.221 was the production model upgraded with a retractable undercarriage and modified turrets in 1935. 11 units were built. It was followed by the F.222 model, which featured numerous modifications. The outer wing panels were given a dihedral, the nose was redesigned and lengthened by 90 cm, and these models received the stronger Morane 14 and 11 engines. 24 units were built from this variant. The type was further developed into the F.223 model, which was redesignated to NC223 after the nationalization of the French aircraft manufacturers. These models used new, stronger Hispano-Suiza engines and had a redesigned and more streamlined fuselage with a new twin-tail design. After several different variants, the 2233 model became the bomber variant, which entered service in 1940, powered by 4 910 horsepower Hispano-Suiza engines. But only 8 units were built from this variant. The 2234 model became the civilian version, with 1100 horsepower Hispano-Suiza engines and a more streamlined nose. Only 3 were built from this variant. The Farman F.220 was 22.57 meters long, with a wingspan of 35.65 meters, roughly the same size as the B-17 bomber. It had an empty weight of 11,000 kilograms and a maximum takeoff weight of 18,700 kilograms. The bomber was powered by 4 Morane radial air-cooled engines, each of them producing 950 horsepower. With these engines, the aircraft could reach a top speed of 360 km an hour and a cruise speed of 280 km an hour. It had a service ceiling of 8,000 meters and a combat range of 2,200 kilometers. The plane's defensive armament included 3 7.5mm machine guns, one in the nose, one in the ventral, and one in the dorsal position. Its usual bomb load was 2,500 kilograms, but for shorter ranges it could carry up to 4,190 kilograms. The Farman bombers started to enter service in 1937, and by the time World War II broke out, the French Air Force had more than 40 of these planes in Europe, while 2 of them were assigned to Indochina and 3 units were sent to the 43rd Air Group in Senegal. At the start of the hostilities, France was the only nation in Europe with heavy bombers, thanks to these planes, though they were built in very low numbers. Their first combat mission took place in December 1939, but it was not a violent one, as they were just dropping leaflets over Munich. When Germany started their Western campaign, only about half of these planes in service were fit for combat missions. The first actual bombing raid they conducted was in May 1940 against one of the BMW factories in Germany. But the quick fall of France meant they only flew 67 sorties altogether before the fighting ended, partly because many of the bombers were under maintenance at any given time, and partly because during the fast and disoriented retreats, the headquarters couldn't issue orders for them. By June 1940, the new NC2233 type started to arrive to the units, but only 7 of these models were delivered, and they did not see any action. The 3 NC2234 civilian variants were also pressed into service, but only one of them, the earlier mentioned Jules Verne, saw action, and became the first aircraft to bomb Berlin in June 1940 during a 13-hour-long mission. The bomber took off from Bordeaux-Marignac, flew north over the English Channel, then followed the Dutch coastline to attack Berlin from the north, and then turned west and safely returned home. In June 1940, when the Battle of France was all but lost, a French pilot, James Denis, flew one of these planes to England, carrying 20 other pilots, where they joined the Free French Air Force. After the fall of France, the remaining planes were used both by the Free French forces and the Vichy regime, but they were converted to transport roles and mainly used in North Africa. In 1943, the Allies captured a number of these Farman planes, and after some repairs, they were now pressed into service on the Allied side. These big bombers, with their impressive bomb load and less impressive looks, were basically the only heavy bombers in Europe in the first part of World War II. But their low numbers and the quick fall of France prevented them to fly too many missions, and they had no real impact on the events. Chapter 5. The Amiot 143 bomber. Bombers were used since the First World War, when the aircraft first became part of the military forces, and they evolved rapidly during the 4 years of fighting. But after the Great War ended, the aircraft evolution slowed down, and during the following decades it stayed quite slow, until the tensions in Europe started to rise again in the mid-1930s. Most newly developed aircraft in the 1920s were still more reminiscent to World War I designs, using open cockpits with barely any thoughts given to aerodynamics during their development, and many of the planes that appeared around that time were still classic biplane designs. The monoplane construction was still a new venture for designers. In 1928, the French officials released the M4 specification for a new multi-seat combat aircraft, which would need to be suitable for reconnaissance, long-range bombing, and escort missions. The Amiot company started to work on a new design for these specifications. This was their Model 140, which evolved into the Model 143 in the following years. The Amiot 140 was an all-metal monoplane design which was cutting-edge at that time, and it was originally planned to be powered by two Lorraine 18G engines. But since these were not available in time, the prototype instead used two 650 horsepower Hispano-Suiza 12 models. The bomber featured a rectangular fuselage with a huge nacelle at the bottom, and as most other aircraft of the time, it used an open cockpit for the pilots and open gun positions. The wings of the aircraft were thick enough so the crew could access the engines during flight if needed. It also used another interesting safety feature. The bomber had 6 separate fuel tanks, and in case of fire, any of those could be jettisoned from the aircraft. Though the Amiot 140 with its high-wing monoplane construction was a fairly modern design for the time, but with its bad aerodynamics and planned combat weight of 5,690 kilograms, the aircraft only had a top speed of 242 km an hour, and its bomb load was only around 900 kilograms. Not very impressive numbers, even by late 1920s standards. The type first flew in 1931, but it was of course not the only design offered for the specifications. And if we look at the planes participating in this competition, we can see the French designers of the time all followed similar approach using a rectangular fuselage. And the list of these planes looks more like a collection of bizarre steampunk machines rather than World War II bombers, including of course the Amiot 140 and its competitors, the Blériot 137, the Breguet 410, the SPC A30, the Bacalan DB20, the Avimeta 121, and the Nieuport NID 53. In the end, only 3 models left competing to win the tender: the Amiot, the Blériot, and the Breguet designs. And from these 3, the Amiot 140 won the competition. An order was issued for the type in November 1933 for 40 aircraft, which were to be upgraded with the 900 horsepower Lorraine 12Q engines. Meanwhile, the company kept working on the design and created the more advanced 141, 142, and 143 models. These newer models used a revised fuselage to allow more space for the crew, which now grew to 5 men. The pilots now had an enclosed cockpit, and the crew could use the defensive armament more effectively, which included enclosed nose and dorsal turrets instead of the open positions used on the 140 model. The 3 updated designs, amongst other differences, all used different engines. The Amiot 141 was planned to use the Lorraine 12Q engines. The 142 type was powered by the Hispano-Suiza 12 models, and finally the 143 used the Nomron 14 KD RS type. As a result of the arrival of the new, more advanced designs and the changes in the requirements towards the aircraft, from the original bomber/reconnaissance role to focus on just the bomber role and better performance, the initial order for the original 140 models was revised to the newer 143 design in the first half of 1934. This caused the interesting situation that the production of the Amiot 143 actually started before the prototype even finished its flight tests. The officials ordered prototypes from both the 142 and 143 models to compare them, from which the 143 model made its maiden flight in August 1934, and the 142 type in January 1935. The 143 model went through several modifications during testing. In September, after the initial flight tests, it received structural strengthening and larger tail surfaces. A month later, it was transferred to the CIMA for official testing. In December, it was fitted with new engine nacelles, and in January 1935, it received a new nose turret, just before the beginning of the armament trials, which were finished in April 1935, the same time the first production model made its maiden flight, thanks to the early production order. The 142 type, using the Hispano-Suiza engines, was delivered to the CIMA in February 1935, just a month after its maiden flight. Apart from using inline engines, this model also had a different tail design, making it 1 meter shorter than the 143. The choice between the two variants eventually came down to a decision that the inline Hispano-Suiza engines will be mainly allocated to fighter production, and thus the 143 model with its radial engines was favored by the Aeronautical Technical Service. In April 1935, further 73 units were added to the initial order of 40 aircraft, and just a month later, a decision was made to equip 5 whole bomber groups with the type. Deliveries of the Amiot 143 started in April 1935, and though this seems early as the testing of the prototype was just finished at the same time, but actually already 7 years passed since the initial requirements were released in 1928. The type officially entered service in July 1935, but by this time it was already falling behind the other new designs that appeared at the same time in other countries. In the same year, the Boeing 299, the prototype for the B-17 Flying Fortress, already made its maiden flight in the US. While in Germany, the Heinkel HG-111 also flew in that year. Both of these planes had around 150 km an hour higher top speed than the Amiot 143, while carrying bigger bomb loads. The initially ordered 40 units from the type retained the original fuel tank design from the 140 model, meaning any of them could be jettisoned if needed. But beginning with the 41st aircraft, the tanks were moved to the outer wing sections and were now fixed. The fuselage on the later models was also 30 cm longer, and they received one additional machine gun and updated radio equipment. And if we are talking about the modifications to the type, let us now take a look at its variants. The Amiot 140 was the original design created for the 1928 tender, still using open cockpit and gunner positions, and it was powered by two 650 horsepower Hispano-Suiza engines. The 141 and 142 were upgraded variants, with enclosed cockpit, redesigned fuselage, enclosed gun turrets, and using the Lorraine 12Q engines on the 141 model, and Hispano-Suiza 12Y engines on the 142 type. Only the 142 variant was built. The Amiot 143 was the upgraded model that eventually went into serial production, using the enclosed cockpit and gun positions, the redesigned fuselage, and Morane 14 radial engines, producing 900 horsepower each. A later revised variant was the 144 model, which was an effort to improve the aerodynamics of the type. It featured retractable landing gear, modified wings and fuselage, and the nose turret was removed. This model first flew in January 1936, but in the end did not enter production. And finally, the Amiot 150 model was developed for the Navy as a torpedo bomber, with larger wingspan and floats instead of wheels. Only one prototype was built, and the program was terminated after its performance proved to be disappointing. The Amiot 143 was 18.24 meters long, with a wingspan of 24.53 meters. It had an empty weight of 5,455 kilograms and a maximum takeoff weight of 10,360 kilograms. The aircraft used two Morane 14 radial air-cooled engines, producing 900 horsepower each. With these engines, it could reach a top speed of 295 km an hour and a cruise speed of 260 km an hour. It had a range of around 1,200 km and a service ceiling of 7,900 meters. The bomber's defensive armament consisted of 4 7.5mm machine guns, and it could carry 800 kilograms of bombs internally and additional 800 kilograms under the wings. Deliveries of the Amiot 143 started in April 1935, and the type entered service in July the same year. But at that point, it was already in development for 7 years, and many more advanced aircraft appeared during this time. In light of the type already showing signs of being outdated compared to more recent bombers like the DO-17 or the earlier mentioned HG-111, it was soon reclassified from the bomber and reconnaissance role to a night bomber. Though the production of the type only lasted until 1938, when it was phased out for new, more advanced types, and some of the units already started to replace it with the new Bloch 131 and LeO 451 types, there were still 5 bomber groups using the type in France and 1 in Africa when World War II broke out. More than 120 of them were still in service when the Battle of France began, though almost half of these planes were under maintenance. The type was mostly used for night bombing raids against German targets. But even on night missions, the big, slow bombers still suffered losses, but despite their aging design, they showed surprisingly good survivability. Interestingly, the French forces lost only around 50 of these old bombers, but still, by the time of the German victory, only 52 of them were still intact in France and 25 in North Africa. These planes stayed in service, though mainly in transport roles in the Tunisian campaign, and some of them later joined the Allied forces after the Axis defeat in Africa. They were used until 1944, when the Amiot 143 models were finally retired, almost 10 years after they entered service. Though the Amiot 143 was designed just before the aviation technologies suddenly started to evolve in a rapid pace, and because of its long development, the type was already obsolete when it entered service, but it still soldiered on and flew missions almost until the end of World War II. And though it was not a success, its interesting bulky design makes it easily recognizable and a very interesting and unique aircraft. A great example of the interwar aircraft design trends.